My husband always left gray hair in the shower. I ran to the doctor and he started to tremble when he saw him. Sarah woke up to the familiar sound of the shower. John, her husband of 10 years, was preparing for another day at the office. She stretched out lazily on the bed, enjoying a few more minutes of quiet before the daily hustle and bustle began. While John was getting dressed, Sarah went into the bathroom to wash her face. That's when he noticed it. Some thin white threads in the shower drain. His heart skipped a beat. How strange, he thought, frowning. John, my love, Sarah called, her voice shaking slightly. Did you see these white hairs in the shower? John peeked into the bathroom, his face a mask of indifference. That? Oh, that. No, I didn't notice. It must be the stress of work, I guess. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. John was only 35, too young to have gray hair, right? She watched her husband adjust his tie, looking for signs of concern on his face. Hey, dude, Sarah said, trying to sound casual. Is everything okay with the job? I noticed something different about you. John turned, his eyes avoiding hers. Everything cool, my queen. Don't worry. But Sarah could feel the tension in his voice, the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped his briefcase. Something was wrong, very wrong. That night, while preparing dinner, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the white hairs. His mind was spinning, imagining 1,000 scenarios, each one worse than the last. Was John sick? Why didn't he tell her anything? My love? Sarah said softly as John entered the kitchen. Are you sure you're okay? You know you can tell me anything, right? John looked at her, and for a moment, Sarah saw a flash of fear, blame, in his eyes. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Simon, Sarah. Everything is 100%, he responded, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. The distance between them, previously imperceptible, now seemed like an abyss. He wanted to scream, to shake John until he told him the truth. But instead, he smiled weakly and served dinner, the weight of unspoken secrets hanging over them both like a dark cloud. That night, lying in bed, listening to John's irregular breathing next to her, Sarah knew her life was about to change forever. What I didn't know was how profound that change would be, nor how much pain it would bring with it. And Sarah's concern grew like a lengthening shadow at dusk. Every morning, with my heart in my throat, I checked the shower. And every morning, there they were, more gray hair, silent witnesses to a secret that threatened to destroy their world. One afternoon, while cleaning the bathroom, Sarah could no longer contain her anguish. Tears ran down her cheeks as she furiously rubbed the drain, as if she could wash away her fears along with those damn white hairs. Now, bastard, she screamed in frustration, throwing the brush against the wall. What the fuck is going on? At that moment, John entered the bathroom, surprised by his wife's outburst. Sarah, my love, what the hell? Why are you crying? He asked, his voice tinged with worry and guilt. Sarah looked at him, her eyes burning with a mix of pain and rage. What the hell? You tell me, John. Every fucking day there are more gray hairs in the shower. I see you change, distant. I can't stand this silence anymore. John paled, his eyes avoiding Sarah's. It's nothing, Clear. It's just the stress of pulling, you know how it gets. But Sarah no longer believed his excuses. She stood up, facing her husband. Don't give me blowjobs, John. Something is happening, and you're hiding it from me. What is it? Are you sick? Or is there someone else? The last question came out as a whisper, loaded with all the fear Sarah had been suppressing. John flinched as if he had been slapped. No, Guy, what do you think? I would never cheat on you. It's just that. His voice trailed off, leaving the sentence incomplete. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. John's silence was more terrifying than any response he could give. John, please, she begged, her voice breaking. Whatever it is, we can face it together. But I need to know the truth. John looked at her, and for a moment, Sarah saw an ocean of pain in his eyes. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it, shaking his head. I'm sorry, my queen. I can't. Not now, he muttered before hurriedly leaving the bathroom. Sarah stood there, shaking, feeling like her life was falling apart around her. John's silence was deafening, filling the house with palpable fear. That night, lying in bed, listening to John's uneasy breathing next to her, Sarah made a decision. If John wouldn't give her answers, she would find them herself. No matter how painful it was, He needed to know the truth. With her heart pounding, Sarah began to plan. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow he would begin to unravel this mystery, regardless of the consequences. Because whatever John was hiding, it was clear that it was consuming them both. And Sarah feared that if she didn't act soon, she could lose everything. The morning came with a palpable tension in the air. Sarah, with dark circles under her eyes from a sleepless night, watched John get ready for work. Her determination grew with each mechanical movement of her husband. "John," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands, "we're going to the doctor today. It is not a suggestion." John froze, his tie half-tied. "Sarah, I already told you I'm fine. I don't need—" "Enough of the lies," Sarah exploded, tears threatening to flow. "Something is wrong, I know it. If you don't want to tell me, let a professional do it." The silence that followed was deafening. John looked at Sarah, and for the first time in weeks, she saw real fear in his eyes. "It's okay," he finally relented, his voice barely above a whisper. "We will go." The ride to Dr. Thompson's office was an ordeal. Sarah felt that every red light was torture, every minute of silence a stab in her heart. In the waiting room, John kept moving his leg, a nervous tic Sarah had never noticed before. She wanted to hold his hand, comfort him, but the distance between them seemed unbridgeable. "John Martinez," the nurse called, and they both stood up like automatons. Dr. Thompson greeted them with a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What brings you here today?" Sarah took a breath, gathering courage. "Doctor, my husband has been different. He finds gray hair in the shower, he's distant, and His voice broke. "I'm afraid it's something serious." The doctor nodded, his expression turning serious. "I understand. John, have you noticed any other symptoms besides premature gray hair?" John opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out. Her eyes filled with tears. I, she stammered, before bursting into tears. Dr. Thompson stood up quickly, approaching John. Sarah, paralyzed by shock, watched the scene as if it were a nightmare. "John, I need you to tell me the truth," the doctor insisted, his voice soft but urgent. "Have you been exposed to anything? Some chemist at work, perhaps?" John looked up, his red eyes meeting Sarah's. "I'm sorry, my love. I didn't want to worry you." Sarah's heart stopped. "What are you talking about, John? What is happening?" Dr. Thompson turned to Sarah, his face a mask of professional concern. "Mrs. Martinez, your husband's symptoms," he paused, as if searching for the right words, "are consistent with prolonged exposure to certain radioactive elements." Sarah's world collapsed in that instant. The words radioactive elements echoed in his head like a terrible echo. "That?" he managed to articulate, his voice barely audible. "How is it possible?" John, between sobs, began to speak. "The new project at the plant. They told us it was safe, but I knew something was wrong. I didn't want to worry you. I thought I could handle it." Sarah felt short of breath. The walls of the office seemed to close in on her. As Dr. Thompson explained the need for immediate testing and possible treatments, Sarah could only look at John, the man she loved, now transformed into a terrified stranger. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, tears running freely down her cheeks. "Why did you face this alone?" John looked at her, his face a mix of guilt and fear. "I was afraid, Sarah. Fear of losing you, of losing everything." In that moment, as the world they knew crumbled around them, Sarah knew that nothing would ever be the same. The future they had planned together was evaporating like fog under the relentless sun of this new reality. Dr. Thompson continued talking, but his words were lost in the ringing that filled Sarah's ears. Only one thing was clear. The battle ahead would be the toughest of their lives, and Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to face it. The trip home was silent torment. Sarah drove, her knuckles white from her grip on the wheel, while John stared out the window, lost in thought. The weight of the unsaid filled the car, suffocating them. Upon arrival, Sarah slammed the door shut and turned to John, her eyes burning with a mix of pain and rage. "Fucking asshole," she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How could you hide something like that from me? We're a team, damn it." John flinched at her words, as if each one were a physical blow. Sarah, I just wanted to protect you. Protect me? Sarah gave a bitter laugh. Of what, John? Of the truth? To be able to be there for you when you needed me most? She sank onto the couch, emotional exhaustion finally catching up to her. John approached her cautiously, as if afraid she might break if he touched her. My queen, forgive me, he pleaded, his voice breaking. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I thought that if I ignored it, maybe what, John? Sarah interrupted, looking up. Maybe it would disappear like magic? Don't suck. Silence fell between them, heavy and oppressive. Sarah could feel the chasm opening between them. Years of trust and love threatened by this secret. What else have you hidden from me, John? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What other lies have you told me? John looked at her, pain evident in his eyes. Nothing more, I swear. This is it. But Sarah didn't know if she could believe him anymore. Doubt had been planted, and he felt that it was taking root in his heart. I need time, he said, standing up. I need to think. She headed to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. John stood in the living room, defeated, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. That night, lying in the bed they once shared so happily, Sarah couldn't sleep. His mind was spinning, going over every moment of the past few months, looking for signs he had missed. How had he not noticed before? Had she been that blind? On the other side of the door, he could hear John shifting restlessly on the couch. I wanted to go to him, comfort him, tell him that everything would be okay. But the truth was that she was no longer sure of anything. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, her eyes swollen from crying and lack of sleep. He found John in the kitchen, making coffee with mechanical movements. Good morning, he murmured, offering her a cup. Sarah took it, her fingers brushing John's for a moment. The contact sent an electric shock through her, a painful reminder of the intimacy they had shared. John, he began, his voice hoarse. I need you to tell me everything, every detail. No more secrets, no more lies. If we're going to get through this together, I need the full truth. John nodded slowly, fear and resignation visible on his face. It's okay, my love. I'll tell you everything. They sat at the kitchen table, coffee forgotten between them. As John began to speak, Sarah felt like she was about to open a Pandora's box. Whatever was going to come out of her, she knew it would change their lives forever. With her heart pounding, Sarah prepared to hear the truth she had feared so much. The question that echoed in his mind was, would he be able to handle what he was about to discover? John took a deep breath, his hands shaking around the coffee cup. Sarah stared at him, her heart pounding, preparing for the worst. It all started 6 months ago, John began, his voice barely above a whisper. The company started a new project, something big, something dangerous. Sarah leaned forward, absorbing every word. What kind of project, John? Nuclear energy, he replied, his eyes avoiding hers. They told us it was safe, that we had all the necessary protection. But, his voice broke, I knew something was wrong. Why didn't you say anything? Sarah asked, frustration evident in her tone. Why didn't you resign? John gave a bitter laugh. What then, Sarah? How were we going to pay the bills? Your mother's treatment? Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. Her mother's cancer treatment had been expensive, and John had insisted that she not worry about money. Oh, John, she murmured, tears threatening to fall again. You exposed yourself to that shit for us? John nodded slowly. At first I thought I could handle it. Then, when I started noticing the changes, I panicked. I didn't want to worry you, not after everything you'd been through with your mom. Sarah stood up abruptly, unable to sit still. He started pacing the kitchen, his mind spinning. And what were you planning to do? He asked, his voice rising. Wait until you were dying to tell me something? I don't know, bastard. John exploded, slamming his fist on the table. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, Sarah. Fear of losing you, of losing everything. Silence fell heavily between them. Sarah looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw the fear and guilt etched into every line of his face. "I need air," he finally said, heading for the door. "Sarah, please," John pleaded, standing up. "Don't go." She stopped, her hand on the doorknob. "I'm not leaving, John. I just need to think." He stepped out into the backyard, the cool morning air hitting his face. She sat on the old swing that John had built for her years ago, when everything seemed simpler. Rocking gently, Sarah began to connect the dots. The overtime, the constant stress, the excuses not to go to the doctor. Everything took on a new and terrible meaning. But there was something else, something John wasn't telling him. He could feel it in the way she avoided his gaze, in the pauses between her words. With renewed determination, Sarah stood up. If John wouldn't give her all the answers, she would find them herself. He took out his phone and dialed a number. "Lupe? It's me, Sarah. I need your help," he said as soon as they answered. "It's about John and his work. Something doesn't add up, and I'm going to find out what it is." As she hung up, Sarah looked toward the house. Through the window, I could see John sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. The love she felt for him fought against the feeling of betrayal and fear. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this," he thought, clenching his fists. "For you, for us, John. Even if it's the last thing I do." With a firm step, Sarah headed back to the house. The truth was out there, and she was determined to find it, no matter how painful it might be. Sarah walked back into the house, her determination burning in her eyes. John was still sitting in the kitchen, his hunched figure the living image of defeat. The air between them was thick with tension, as if a storm was about to break. "John," Sarah said, her voice firm but trembling, "I know there's more. I need you to tell me everything right now." John looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "Sarah, please, I can't take it anymore." "No, damn mother," Sarah exploded, slamming the table. "No more secrets. What else are you hiding from me?" The silence that followed was deafening. John seemed to struggle with himself, his hands visibly shaking. He began, his voice barely audible. "I'm not the only one, Sarah. There are others on the plant." Sarah felt the ground part beneath her feet. "What do you mean you're not the only one?" John took a deep breath. "There are several of us who are sick. The company knows this, but they are pressuring us not to say anything." "Fucking bastards!" Sarah shouted, anger mixing with fear in her voice. "How can they do this? Why haven't they reported it?" "Because they've got us by the balls, Sarah," John replied, his voice cracking. "They threatened to take away our health insurance, to destroy our careers. Some have families, mortgages." Sarah sank into the chair, the weight of the revelation crushing her. "My God, John, what are we going to do?" "I don't know, my love," John whispered, extending his trembling hand toward her. "I'm afraid." Sarah looked at her husband's hand, hesitating for a moment before taking it. Despite the anger and betrayal she felt, the love she had for John was still there, fighting against everything. "Listen to me, you bastard," Sarah said, squeezing John's hand. "Let's fight this. I'm not going to let those bastards get away with this." John looked at her, a spark of hope shining in his tired eyes. They are very powerful, Sarah. They have lawyers, money, and we have the truth," Sarah responded, her determination growing. "And I swear by the most sacred thing that I am going to make the whole world know it." At that moment, Sarah's phone vibrated. It was a message from Lupe. "I found something. It's big, Sarah. We need to talk now." Sarah looked at John, her heart pounding. "This is just beginning, my love. And I promise you that I will not rest until justice is done." As she got up to call Lupe, Sarah felt a mix of fear and adrenaline coursing through her veins. She didn't know exactly what they were up against, but she was determined to fight tooth and nail. The battle ahead would be tough, possibly dangerous. But as she looked at John, Sarah knew she had no choice. This was a war they had to win, not only for themselves, but for all the families who were suffering in silence. With her heart in her throat, Sarah dialed Lupe's number. Whatever her friend had discovered, she knew she was about to enter some very murky waters. But for John, For her future, she was willing to face whatever it took. Sarah stared at John, her mind trying to process the magnitude of what she had just heard. The truth, so raw and painful, seemed to crush her. "So," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "are you telling me that the company knew about the risks all along?" John nodded slowly, his eyes filled with shame and fear. "Yes, my love. They knew it from the beginning." Sarah felt anger rising inside her, mixing with pain and disbelief. "Fucking assholes," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "How could they do this to them? How could you?" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. John flinched at her words, as if each one were a physical blow. "I know, Sarah. I know," she murmured, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was an asshole. I should have told you something. I should have done something." Sarah stood up abruptly, unable to sit still. He started pacing the kitchen, his mind spinning. "How many more, John?" she asked, turning to him. "How many others are sick like you?" John closed his eyes, as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. "At least a dozen that I know of. Maybe more." Sarah felt short of breath. A dozen families, a dozen lives destroyed by greed and negligence. "We have to do something," he said, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. "We can't let them get away with this." John looked at her, fear evident in his eyes. "Sarah, you don't understand. They are powerful. They have lawyers, money." "I'm fine, Mother," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. "What, are we just going to sit there while you die? While you all die?" At that moment, Sarah's phone rang. It was Lupe. "Well?" Sarah answered, her voice strained. "Sarah, you have to come see me right now," Lupe said, her voice urgent. "I found something. Something big." Sarah looked at John, her heart pounding. "I'm going there," he said before hanging up. He turned to John, determination shining in his eyes. "Listen to me carefully, John. Let's fight this. Together. I don't care what it costs, I don't care what we have to do. We're gonna make those bastards pay for what they've done." John looked at her, a mix of fear and hope on his face. "Sarah, I'm afraid." Sarah approached him, taking his face in her hands. "I'm afraid too, my love, but I'm more afraid of losing you without having fought." She leaned down and kissed him softly, feeling the tremor on his lips. Then he stepped away, grabbed his keys, and headed for the door. "I'm going to see Lupe," he said. "When he returns, we will plan our next step. This won't stay like this, I swear to you." As she left the house, Sarah felt a mix of overwhelming emotions. Fear, anger, determination. She didn't know exactly what she was facing, but she was sure of one thing. This battle was just beginning, and she was ready to fight with everything she had. Sarah sat in the kitchen, her hands shaking around a cup of cold coffee. John's words echoed in his head like an endless echo. The truth, so raw and painful, had left her breathless. "Don't suck, John," she murmured to herself, tears threatening to fall again. "How could you hide something like that from me?" Just then, John walked into the kitchen, his face a mask of guilt and fear. "Sarah, my love, Don't call me my love," Sarah exploded, standing up suddenly. "You have no right." John recoiled as if he had been slapped. "Please, let me explain." "Explain to me what, bastard?" Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. "That you've been exposing yourself to radiation for months? That the company knew about it and did nothing? That you could be dying and you decided not to tell me anything?" Tears were streaming freely down Sarah's face now, a mix of rage and pure pain. John tried to get closer, but she shoved him away with a sharp gesture. "Don't touch me," he hissed. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this, John. I don't know if I want to." The silence that followed was deafening. John slumped into a chair, defeated. "I did it for us, Sarah. For our family. We needed the money And? Sarah interrupted. "Did you think it was better for me to watch you die slowly without knowing why? That it was better to leave me and the children alone?" The mention of children was like a punch in the gut for both of them. Sarah felt short of breath. How was he going to explain this to his children? "My God, John," she whispered, the weight of reality falling on her. "What are we going to do now?" John looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know my life. I really don't know." Sarah found herself at an emotional crossroads. On the one hand, she wanted to scream, to hit John, to make him feel all the pain she was feeling. On the other hand, the love she felt for him, the father of her children, the man with whom she had shared so many years, fought against betrayal. "I need time," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to think." He headed towards the door, but before leaving, he turned to John. "I'm going to fight for you, for us, but I don't know if I can do it with you by my side right now." With those words, Sarah left the house, leaving John alone with the weight of his decisions. As she walked aimlessly down the street, Sarah felt like her world was crumbling around her. How was he going to protect his family? How could I fight against a company that did not care about the lives of its workers? And most importantly, how was she going to save John, the love of her life, when she wasn't even sure she could forgive him? With each step, Sarah felt like she was entering unknown and dangerous territory. But one thing was clear: he was not going to give up without a fight. For John, for his children, for his future. Even if that meant facing forces much more powerful than her. The battle ahead would be the toughest of her life, and Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for it. But as the sun set on the horizon, a fierce determination began to grow within him. Whatever came, he would face it, because love, even wounded, was stronger than any betrayal. Sarah sat in the hospital waiting room, her hands shaking as she held a coffee that had already gone cold. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, and now, as she waited for the results of John's latest tests, she felt like she was on the edge of a cliff. "Mrs. Martinez," a nurse called, breaking her out of her thoughts. "The doctor will see you now." With her heart pounding, Sarah stood up and followed the nurse down the hallway. Every step felt like he was walking towards his sentence. Dr. Thompson greeted her with a grave expression that made Sarah's stomach twist in fear. "Sit down, please," the doctor said, pointing to a chair in front of his desk. Sarah sat up, her legs barely supporting her. "How is John? The results?" Dr. Thompson took a deep breath before speaking. "Ms. Martinez, I regret to inform you that John's condition has worsened. The radiation exposure was more severe than we initially thought." Sarah felt like the world stopped. The doctor's words echoed in his ears, but he couldn't fully process them. What does that mean?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "It means we need to start more aggressive treatment immediately," the doctor answered. "But I have to be honest with you, the chances of a full recovery are limited." Sarah felt short of breath. "No, it can't be," she murmured, tears beginning to fall. "There has to be something else we can do." Dr. Thompson looked at her with compassion. "There is an experimental treatment we could try, but it is risky and very expensive, and there are no guarantees that it will work." Sarah clung to that small hope like a castaway to a life preserver. "Whatever, doctor, we will do what is necessary." But then reality hit her like a fist to the stomach. John's treatment had already depleted his savings and insurance barely covered the basics. How were they going to pay for an experimental treatment? We, Sarah stammered, shame mixing with fear. "I don't know if we can afford it." Dr. Thompson nodded understandingly. "I understand. There are options we can explore, assistance programs." But Sarah was barely listening to him. His mind was spinning, desperately searching for a solution. It was then that he remembered the conversation he had had with Lupe last week about the possibility of suing John's company. "Doctor," Sarah interrupted, a spark of determination lighting up in her eyes. "What if we could prove that John's company was negligent? Could that help with treatment costs?" Dr. Thompson looked at her surprised. "Well, yes, potentially, but those cases can take years." "It doesn't matter," Sarah said, standing up. "I will do whatever it takes to save John." As she left the office, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and determination. He knew that the path he was about to take would be difficult and dangerous. Taking on a large corporation would not be easy, and the consequences could be devastating. But as she walked to John's room, Sarah knew she had no choice. For the love of her life, for their future together, she was willing to risk everything. "I'm going to save you, my love," he whispered, clenching his fists. "Even if it's the last thing I do." What Sarah didn't know was that her decision was about to trigger a series of events that would change her life forever, leading her down a path full of danger, betrayals, and shocking revelations. The real challenge was just beginning. Sarah sat in the hospital waiting room, her hands shaking as she held a coffee that had already gone cold. The last few weeks had been hell, and now, as she waited for the results of John's latest tests, she felt like she was on the edge of a cliff. Dr. Thompson appeared in the hallway, his face a mask of professionalism that failed to completely hide his concern. "Mrs. Martinez," he called softly, "can we talk in private?" Sarah felt her heart stop. On shaky legs, he followed the doctor to his office. "How is John?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Thompson took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm afraid the news is not good, Sarah. John's condition has worsened significantly. The cellular damage caused by radiation is extensive." Sarah felt like the world was crumbling around her. What does that mean?" she managed to ask, tears threatening to fall. "It means we need to consider more aggressive treatment options," the doctor responded. "There is an experimental procedure that could help, but what?" Sarah interrupted, clinging to that small hope. "It's extremely risky and very expensive," Dr. Thompson explained cautiously. "Insurance doesn't cover it." Sarah felt short of breath. John's treatment had already depleted his savings, and now this. "How much?" he asked, fearing the answer. When Dr. Thompson mentioned the number, Sarah felt the ground open beneath her feet. It was an astronomical amount, much more than they could raise in a lifetime. We can't," she stammered, tears running freely down her cheeks. Dr. Thompson looked at her with compassion. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I know this is difficult," but Sarah was barely listening to him. His mind was spinning, desperately searching for a solution. It was then that he remembered the conversation he had had with Lupe last week about the possibility of suing John's company. "Doctor," Sarah interrupted, a spark of determination lighting up in her eyes. "What if we could prove that John's company was negligent? Could that help with treatment costs?" Dr. Thompson looked at her surprised. "Well, yes, potentially, but those cases can take years." "It doesn't matter," Sarah said, standing up. "I will do whatever it takes to save John." He left the office with a new resolve. In the hallway, she came face to face with John, who was waiting anxiously for her. "What did the doc tell you, my love?" he asked, his voice shaking. Sarah looked at him, her heart torn between the love she felt for him and the fear of the uncertain future that awaited them. "John," he began, taking her hands in his. "Things are going to get difficult, very difficult, but I promise you that I will fight with everything I have. We're going to get out of this together. Do you hear me?" John looked at her, his eyes filled with tears and a mixture of fear and love. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." "No, my dear," Sarah replied firmly. "It's the fault of those bastards who put you in danger. And I swear to you by the most sacred thing that they are going to pay for this." As they left the hospital, Sarah felt a mixture of determination and terror. He knew the path he was about to take would be dangerous and could cost him everything. But looking at John, he knew he had no choice. "Let's go home, love," he said softly. "We have a lot to plan." What Sarah didn't know was that her decision was about to trigger a series of events that would change her life forever, leading her down a path full of danger, betrayals, and shocking revelations. The real battle was just beginning, and Sarah was about to find out what she was really made of. Sarah sat in the hospital waiting room, her hands shaking as she held a coffee that had already gone cold. The last few weeks had been an emotional hell, and now, as she waited for the results of John's latest tests, she felt like she was on the edge of a cliff. "Mrs. Martinez," a nurse called, breaking her out of her thoughts. "The doctor will see you now." With her heart pounding, Sarah stood up and followed the nurse down the hallway. Every step felt like he was walking towards his sentence. Dr. Thompson greeted her with a grave expression that made Sarah's stomach twist in fear. "Sit down, please," the doctor said, pointing to a chair in front of his desk. Sarah sat up, her legs barely supporting her. "How is John? The results?" Dr. Thompson took a deep breath before speaking. "Ms. Martinez, I regret to inform you that John's condition has worsened. The cellular damage caused by radiation is extensive." Sarah felt like the world stopped. The doctor's words echoed in his ears, but he couldn't fully process them. What does that mean?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "It means we need to consider more aggressive treatment options," the doctor responded. "There is an experimental procedure that could help, but what?" Sarah interrupted, clinging to that small hope. "It's extremely risky and very expensive," Dr. Thompson explained cautiously. "Insurance doesn't cover it." Sarah felt short of breath. John's treatment had already depleted his savings, and now this. "How much?" he asked, fearing the answer. When Dr. Thompson mentioned the number, Sarah felt the ground open beneath her feet. It was an astronomical amount, much more than they could raise in a lifetime. We can't," she stammered, tears running freely down her cheeks. Dr. Thompson looked at her with compassion. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I know this is difficult," but Sarah was barely listening to him. His mind was spinning, desperately searching for a solution. It was then that he remembered the conversation he had had with Lupe last week about the possibility of suing John's company. "Doctor," Sarah interrupted, a spark of determination lighting up in her eyes. "What if we could prove that John's company was negligent? Could that help with treatment costs?" Dr. Thompson looked at her surprised. "Well, yes, potentially, but those cases can take years." "It doesn't matter," Sarah said, standing up. "I will do whatever it takes to save John." He left the office with a new resolve. In the hallway, she came face to face with John, who was waiting anxiously for her. "What did the doc tell you, my love?" he asked, his voice shaking. Sarah looked at him, her heart torn between the love she felt for him and the fear of the uncertain future that awaited them. "John," he began, taking her hands in his. "Things are going to get difficult, very difficult, but I promise you that I will fight with everything I have. We're going to get out of this together. Do you hear me?" John looked at her, his eyes filled with tears and a mixture of fear and love. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." "No, my dear," Sarah replied firmly. "It's the fault of those bastards who put you in danger. And I swear to you by the most sacred thing that they are going to pay for this." As they left the hospital, Sarah felt a mixture of determination and terror. He knew the path he was about to take would be dangerous and could cost him everything. But looking at John, he knew he had no choice. "Let's go home, love," he said softly. "We have a lot to plan." What Sarah didn't know was that her decision was about to trigger a series of events that would change her life forever, leading her down a path full of danger, betrayals, and shocking revelations. The real battle was just beginning, and Sarah was about to find out what she was really made of. Sarah sat in the hospital waiting room, her hands shaking as she held a coffee that had already gone cold. The last few weeks had been an emotional hell, and now, as she waited for the results of John's latest tests, she felt like she was on the edge of a cliff. Suddenly, a commotion in the hallway caught his attention. Nurses and doctors were running towards the intensive care unit. Sarah's heart stopped for a moment. "No, please, don't let it be John," she thought desperately. He jumped up, following the chaos. As he approached John's room, he heard a familiar voice shouting, "Aide, my husband is not breathing." It was the voice of Maria, the wife of Carlos, another worker at the plant who had also been exposed to radiation. Sarah felt like the world stopped. Could this be John's fate too? With her heart in her throat, Sarah approached John's room. She found him awake, staring at the door with a terrified expression on his face. "Sarah," John whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "What's going on?" Sarah ran towards him, taking his hand in hers. "It's Carlos, my love. Something bad has happened." John closed his eyes, tears beginning to fall. My God, Sarah, what have we done? What have they done to us? At that moment, Dr. Thompson entered the room, his face a mask of professionalism that barely concealed his concern. John, Sarah, he began, his voice deep. I have news, the results of the latest tests. But before he could continue, Sarah's cell phone rang. It was Lupe. Sarah. Lupe's voice sounded urgent. We got it. We get the evidence against the company. They're screwed, dude. Let's take those bastards down. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. They finally had what they needed to bring justice. But at what cost? John, Sarah said, turning to her husband. Lupe did it. We have the evidence. John looked at her, a mix of hope and fear in his eyes. And now what, my love? What are we going to do? Dr. Thompson looked at them confused. What are they talking about? What tests? Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. Everything they had been through, all the pain and fear, had led to this moment. Doctor, Sarah began, her voice shaking but firm. There's something you need to know. Something that is going to change everything. As Sarah began to explain, she felt like they were on the edge of a cliff. What happened next would determine not only their future, but that of all affected workers and their families. Fear and anticipation mixed in his chest. Would this be enough to save John? To do justice? Or had they arrived too late? With her heart pounding, Sarah prepared herself for what was to come. Whatever it was, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. Sarah was standing in front of the hospital window, her gaze lost on the horizon. The past few months had been a roller coaster of emotions, and now, in this moment of calm, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in a long time. Mrs. Martinez, a nurse called from the door. Your husband is awake. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. With trembling steps, he made his way to John's room. There he was, pale and drawn, but with a spark in his eyes that I hadn't seen in months. Hey, Guy, John said weakly, with a small smile. Sarah approached the bed, taking his hand in hers. Hello, my love, she responded, tears threatening to fall. How do you feel? Like I got hit by a trailer, John joked. But I'm alive, thanks to you. Sarah felt her throat close up. All the memories of the last few months flooded her. The fight against the company, the sleepless nights investigating, the trial, and finally, the experimental treatment that had saved John's life. I thought I was going to lose you, Sarah whispered, tears running freely down her cheeks. John squeezed his hand. I thought so too, my queen, but you're a badass. You never gave up. Sarah gave a breathy laugh. Of course not, asshole. I told you, didn't I? We were going to get out of this together. They looked at each other in silence for a moment, years of love, pain and struggle reflected in their eyes. What now, Sarah? John asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. How are we going to continue after all this? Sarah took a deep breath. It was a question she had been asking herself. The legal battle against the company was not yet over, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Well, my love, I have no fucking idea, he answered honestly. But what I do know is that we are going to do it together, step by step, day by day. John smiled, and Sarah saw in that smile the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Pray to him then, said John. Together. At that moment, Dr. Thompson entered the room, his face serious but with a hint of a smile. Good news, he announced. The latest tests show significant improvement. If everything continues like this, John will be able to go home in a few weeks. Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. He looked at John, saw the hope in his eyes, and knew that despite everything they had been through, this was just the beginning. Did you hear that, bastard? He said, leaning down to kiss John's forehead. Let's go home. As the sun set outside the hospital window, Sarah allowed herself, for the first time in a long time, to think about the future. It wouldn't be easy, I knew it. There were still battles to fight, wounds to heal. But looking at John, she felt a certainty that filled her with strength. Together, they could face anything. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel. There will always be new videos, and you won't want to miss any of these. Thrills.